Asked. I just feel like there needs to be fanfare, some
Some sort of
fireworks,
intro music, yeah, or something.
some intro music. Maybe you can work on that. Do you know any musicians, JD?
A couple, you know.
Yeah, okay, I was about to say. Hey, good morning, Chandler. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well.
All right, so I thought we'd get to it. We got a lot to talk about this week. I tell you what's really cool. Excuse um, my cluttered page here is we've been going through this. I mean, I'm tired of using the word historic, but this there's with everything Trump's doing and everything that's kind of changing in culture in the West, or primarily in the United States. There's just a little bit to talk about. But I figure we should start where any good Christian should, and that's with the scripture. It just seemed like it was very poignant for us to talk or start with Ecclesiastes. And for the next little bit, I'd like for Ecclesiastes to be kind of where we center. As you guys know, Ecclesiastes was written, it's attributed to Solomon, but let's go ahead and start here. First chapter, verses 1 through 3. This is the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanities of vanities. All is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? So what do you
Ladies and
think, Mark? What do
gentlemen,
you think
biblical nihilism. There you go.
so explain that. I'd like to hear it. What do you mean by biblical nihilism?
Oh, don't take the scripture down. I was keeping my eye on it. I get what you're doing. I've got it over here. Never mind. Yeah. So I mean, it's just if you were looking at it from a kind of a secular perspective, right? I mean, it's basically very nihilistic, which means that life really has no purpose or meaning. That basically from a naturalistic perspective, we're just stardust. From stardust we came, and from stardust we return, and to stardust we return. So it's just
Yeah, that's the so Chandler, you and I talk a lot about science fiction. And wouldn't you say if you take science fiction and you project it forward with a lot of dystopian, do you see that worldview kind of in a lot of common modern kind of science fiction stuff? You and I have talked about that before.
Definitely. I mean, I think a lot of science fiction authors come from the perspective that JD was talking about, a very naturalistic, secular, non-religious perspective. And so they simply extend their own morals and own values onto the future, project it.
Yeah.
And often this is what results from it. Um, and I think there is an observation here that many people, including religious folks, have, right? I mean, I'm sure everyone has at some point or another wondered if things matter, wonder like why they're there, right? This isn't something that only secular folks deal with, right? And I think that's something about the Bible, or something about this particular book of the Bible. It answers or it asks questions that lots of people have.
I agree. We're all searching for our telos, right? Our purpose, right?
Yeah, like that purpose that Aristotle said. That's right. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, again, I think that's a very valid point. I mean, and that really speaks to the kind of the what I sometimes call the universal desire for meaning, right? Which I believe actually points to the existence of God, right? So why if we're just molecules in motion, right? Chemicals, reacting. What? Why would that? How would that, emerge? To use a very naturalistic frame of reference, how would that emerge from just the random processes and chemical reactions that we have? Where does meaning originate? Right.
That's interesting that you guys both say that, and it's interesting where you combine the term biblical nihilism, right? Because without God, things are worthless. I mean, that's my belief. I mean, eventually, you even even in the best of cases, if you look at evolution and say we're we're getting to something better, like we're going to this utopian state, well, you have to die for
Yeah.
your
Right.
genes to be passed off in a
Yeah.
better way, right? And
Right.
the best you can say is, at least I'm not that monkey anymore. Like, at least I'm not in the slot, right? At
Well,
some point, it
and
becomes,
the idea too is that there's this hope. Christians are all about hope, right? I mean, particularly, we have, our faith is built around hope, and the kind of the naturalist view, particularly from the technological perspective and how we're seeing the development of AI, the expansion of technology capabilities. I think they're starting to get a hope that this mythical singularity thing they're talking about happens, and we have the ability to have eternal life, quote unquote, through the capabilities associated with technology advancements.
having our consciousness uploaded into the machine.
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh, can you say the word matrix?
Oh, Matrix.
I feel
there's
like there
just-
are a lot of movies
Oh
that
yeah.
warn about the potential downsides of going down that particular route.
Yeah, isn't there a television show called Upload too? Was that the name
Is
of it?
that what it? I don't. I know that some of my book that I wrote, right? And I got something later to talk about that, because I've been looking for evidence of kind of this overuse of AIs.
Yeah.
I've been looking for evidence, and I think I found some, but that's a spoiler. I'm gonna hold on it for a minute. So the vanity of vanities, this biblical nihilism, is this idea that there's this meaninglessness, and it's all centered around Solomon. Solomon being, it's centered around God and that kind of thing. But the author of Solomon, that's what I was trying to say, who basically united, he's known as one of the most wise. Chandler, you're kind of an anthropology dude. I mean, you have your degree in it. Tell me what you were telling me. I remember a while back we were having a conversation about Solomon. Do you have some information on who he was, not just to the Jewish people? He's certainly significant, but you actually told me, I believe you told me he was kind of significant from that time, like in the whole region. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, definitely. There's evidence and a lot of details from, you know, historical what we have from that particular time of the United Kingdom, of a great deal, a great and influential nation state that certainly was able to exert a lot of power, not only you know around its neighbors, but also within the wider region. So certainly it's very interesting from a historical perspective. But I mean, Solomon himself, even as a character, even as a figure, he sort of transcended the historical reality, right? And moved towards, this figure that's known for his wisdom. You have that saying, the wisdom of Solomon, right?
Yeah.
That's a fairly common one, not just in like the Judeo-Christian world. Muslims also revere him. He's found even in like more secular understandings of, what does it mean to be a wise person? He's sort of in some, secular circles viewed as almost a proto philosopher, or, you know, someone who was like Socrates, like Plato, like these later
So
contemporary.
that's what you mean by proto philosopher, like the proto meaning one, like the first one, like a prime philosopher.
Early. Yeah.
Early, yeah.
Yeah.
Because he lived before a lot of the
Yeah, well,
main
that's why
philosophers.
it was called the preacher as opposed to the philosopher, right?
Right. It wasn't a concept. That's the way they would
Hmm.
articulate it. Yeah.
So it's interesting in the biblical accounts, right? So everybody knows he was, should know his real name is Jedediah, which is, I've heard that we're from Mississippi, so I know I've heard that word, but
I think I have a cousin Jedediah somewhere.
you
Yeah.
do not have a cousin Jedediah. 'Cause that would be awesome. One of the things I like about the story and the narrative in the Bible, like every word is written there, especially in the narrative, to instruct us about something. Right?
Yep.
Not a word is wasted in the Bible. And when he gives when the biblical account, when I say he, I mean God is the main author of it, gives the biblical account of the life of Solomon. He also talks about a dream that Solomon has. And I thought, I love the wiki pages because I think they do a good job of kind of collecting the secular the knowledge of things, right? Well, as you know, in this in this particular story, in the narrative here, God comes to Solomon and he says, I'm going to give you whatever you want, um, uh, and because you're leading my people, you're the king of my people. And Solomon asked for wisdom, and God says, I'm going to give you a double portion. And and that's kind of an interesting take. It's interesting that he said that, right? He could have said, give me lots of horses, give me lots of wealth, give me an army that can't be defeated, but he asked for wisdom. How do you think that request, not only how significant was that request back then, but how do you think that kind of covers over the ages? Like, wisdom is still needed today, and I'm just kind of curious of what you guys think about that particular ask.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand what wisdom is also, right? Because wisdom is not knowledge, right? Wisdom is not science, right? Scientia, which is the root of the word science, or it really means knowledge, right? So we have unprecedented access to knowledge today, right? But what we are seeing is that we have a paucity of wisdom, right? Not just from the perspective of science. I'm not trying to beat up science, although I will beat up material naturalism. But what I'm
Swing
saying
away.
is we have vast storehouses of historical, scientific, philosophical, all of these areas of existence, knowledge that's associated with it, and yet we still see, all of the continued issues with human existence. Right? We still see these things even today, even though we have all these knowledge, access to all this knowledge. So now let's relate that to wisdom, right? Wisdom is, having access to knowledge, but being able to apply it in a way that has a beneficial outcome. So that's what wisdom is to me. Knowledge that enables beneficial outcomes.
Yeah, yeah. Chandler, do you have what is your take on? I want to hear. That's a great point, JD. Chandler, what do you think? What do you think wisdom is?
I definitely agree. I think to JD's point, um, people today, modern civilization, absolutely do have access to lots of information, but I would say the average person is probably not quite as knowledgeable in some ways as someone, even 100, 200 years ago, right? When you were having to, survive, and to survive, you would need to know all of these things about the natural world.
Good point.
That was different.
That's
But
interesting.
again, we do have so much. We have the internet, and that's obviously leaps and bounds ahead of. But I would also say that when it comes to, when you look at the materialistic perspective, that all you have is a scientific method, right? That's the only way you can make sense of the world, essentially. It's interesting. There's limitations to it because it's very much a human science, right? And from their own perspective, nothing is truly subjective, right? Or truly objective, I should say.
Right.
Including the scientific method, right? It's biased. It's full of hierarchy. It's not a very good way of understanding the world. Even history, right? Like when you look at the historical research into this particular time of ancient Israel, right? They find these things, and they can only judge off of what they have. So it's a bias, right? Imagine that, you tell a few people, you have a classroom of students and you tell them to write about what it was like to live when they were in first grade, right? And they write these, on their scraps of paper, and they pass it up to you, and you tell them, okay, well, your scrap of paper, your piece of paper, that was lost in a fire. Oh, and yours, that was deemed, politically subversive by the state and burned, right? And you narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down until all you have are like 2 or 3 pieces of paper written by people, about their lives, 4 or 5 years ago. That's all you know about that year. And that's what historians judge in some cases.
Interesting.
And
Yeah,
people,
I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah.
I don't know, I call it a principle. that I call the principle of uncertainty, right?
Like,
Which is really, and this applies broadly across all disciplines, is that our certainty of of the occurrence of a particular event or the sequence of events degrades as we are further and further away from the source event, right?
Sure.
So that I think that really is aligns well with what you're talking about. Is that we have, the further back we look in time, and the evidence that we have as we look back in time becomes greater and greater, dependent on interpretive frameworks, right?
definitely.
It's interesting you talk about that because it's very similar to a theory in physics called the Doppler effect.
Yeah.
It's the apparent change of a wave dependent on your position. So if you take that position and you apply it across time and space, as opposed to like macro time and space instead of micro time and space, which is what you do in some of the stuff where you're looking at radio waves and that kind of thing, you're doing a very short period of time. But if you take a long period of time, you can almost apply that principle anthropologically, because there is a sense that we lose the meaning of something from Solomon's time. Even we lose the meaning, like the language has shifted multiple times, like everything. That's the vanity upon vanities of everything. We sit here in our current day and age and say we know what Solomon was doing, like we know what this means back then. We know
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
right?
We're certain, right?
Mhm.
We're certain. We
Yeah,
know that there were trans people in Rome. We know that. They just didn't find the right
Right.
bathroom. That's what the problem was.
yeah,
It's funny because we often find ourselves falling into this trap of modernism, but not modernism. I don't think that's the right word. I would say this bias that says everybody has thought the same way that we do now, and we apply
chronological
everything.
snobbery. C.S.
Sure,
Lewis called it
chronological snobbery.
chronological
Or
snobbery.
That's
recency
a good one.
bias or whatever. There's a
Recency
ton of names
bias,
for it.
presentism, I think is what some
Yeah,
refer to
Presentism.
that.
presentism.
Oh my gosh, could we make
Um,
words?
And you know, it's not just for the past. You see that also. We mentioned science fiction a while ago. Star Trek, for instance, is basically just you know 21st century, 20th century Americans in space.
That's right.
Like there's a lot of, and you can't help it necessarily, right? We don't know how people are going to think necessarily in the future, but you only can judge off of what you know. But I think even though there are differences between Solomon's time and any biblical person's time and ours, the timelessness of Ecclesiastes as a book, I think,
Hmm.
is in part due to the fact that he's asking these questions that
Yep.
seem to be universal, like throughout
Yep.
time and space in every culture,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, I think
This isn't.
I've always thought that. Sorry, Chandler. I've always thought that. I didn't mean to step on you. Did you have something else?
You're fine. No,
Yep.
you're fine.
Um, I've always thought of Ecclesiastes as kind of the antithesis of the Sermon on the Mount, right?
Mhm.
So, and it's interesting that Solomon asks these questions that Jesus is going to answer on the cross. Like he's going to give meaning to, this human existence that we have because of basically because of his death on the cross, right? And his resurrection. He's going to give meaning to that vanity. But what has to happen first, and this is all in God's providence, is that somebody has to ask the question, like,
Yep.
what is this existential hangover that we as human beings have? Why is this the case? Well, it's because of the fall. It's because entropy hits everything we do. It's because what becomes unstraight can't be straightened, right? And we'll talk about that later in later weeks. But the point is that that's why the preacher starts here. I want to add too that I concur, of course, because you both are friends of mine with your positions. But to put it a little, this is kind of the way. This is going to be my post. What is wisdom? And I'm going to say it is informed intelligence. And that's all. I think that's a more succinct way to say it's informed by the Holy Spirit. It's informed by evidence. It's been informed by um, the discernment that we've been given. It's been informed by the scriptures. It's informed intelligence. I saw this guy really was a big deal to me. I saw this guy named Arthur Brooks. He was on the John Deloney show, and he was talking about how he's a social scientist. He's a neuroscientist. He was talking about how we process information. And they asked him about technology and what it's doing to us as human beings, because a lot of people believe in the social science, and I believe it too, that modern technology is actually rewriting some of our neural pathways. And that's why I was interested in the podcast. But he was also talking about this one thing that I'd like to mention, and kind of ties into what JD says, both of you said actually, is the fact that current technology and our current way of thinking only really is processed in the left side of the brain. Where you discern and where you think and where you quantify things and reason and consider is actually happens in the right side. And it's very interesting too that all this technology is helping us do things faster. But the questions that say whether we should do that thing, whether it's actually right to do, the part where we puzzle, that happens on the other side of the brain, and that's being ignored by a lot of this technology. We're just kind of, let's just keep going, let's keep going. And the right side of the brain stops and says, hold on. Is it wise for us to do this? Is it wise for this to start that part? It was just kind of an interesting thought. So moving on to, you guys are okay with that. Moving on to,
Well, hang tight. What did you say? What did you say that you're going to post as your definition of wisdom?
Informed intelligence.
So AI then would have wisdom?
No, informed. I was going to say informed. I was going to say, okay, it was a little trick. You caught me. You're not supposed to call me out.
I decompose things because I really, to me, that is a really, I don't think it actually accurately captures the humanity of wisdom, right?
Well, I was going to ask you, I was actually kind of goading people into a little bit of a fight, and I wanted them to say informed by what, and then I was going to be constrained. I was going to put constraints on which.
Okay.
It's funny that we talk about me.
You weren't supposed to call me out in front of everybody, but
that's
my
job, man. That's what I do.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good.
It's funny that we talk about meaning, and on the screen you have Jordan Peterson staring at us, and
that dude,
he's something.
He is. Yeah, I'm still on the fence, but go ahead.
Well, my big problem with him is that he just never says what he actually believes, and he gets lost in this weird Jungian interpretation of the world.
Yeah,
everything's a symbol. And he was interviewed by this prominent secular guy, Alex O'Connor, who's pretty good when it comes to interviewing people. He gives folks a fairly good shake, or a perspective, an ability to share their perspective. And he tried to pin him down. He's like, so if you went back, because he kept asking me, like, did you believe that Jesus Christ literally rose from the dead?
Right.
And he would be very evasive about that. And so to basically pin him down, Alex O'Connor said, okay, this is what I'm asking you, Jordan. If you went back to his tomb on this time with a camcorder and were recording, would a man, Jesus of Nazareth, emerge from that tomb 3 days after his death? And Jordan Peterson said, I suspect yes, but I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
To a lot of people,
I think though, I mean, you go back to the certainty principle, right? And so you're maybe giving me a little bit more of appreciation for his worldview, because I think that he does have a skepticism of certainty, right? I think he absolutely has a skepticism of certainty.
Now
skepticism of just about everything.
Of certainty.
What do
you mean by that?
Well, so again, you were talking earlier how we say we know this and we know that. I think he's skeptical of making statements of absolute certainty. Not that he doesn't believe in absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that he sees the fuzzy edges of interpretation versus fact, right?
Yeah.
And so he tends to. And we're gonna psychoanalyze Jordan Peterson here, I guess.
Especially when I barely know him. I just saw him.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Well, to be fair, that's what he does to everybody.
Yeah. Okay. That's his thing.
So really, I mean, he has his own vast storehouse of knowledge based on his experiences with not only what he has studied, but also how he has interacted with, very, very intelligent people with very, very strong viewpoints, right? And I think, we going back to that skepticism of certainty. I think that he tends to probe that, but I think he's also, which I find admirable. I think he's skeptical of his own certainty. Do you understand what I'm
Mhm.
saying?
Hmm.
And
Yeah, I like
so,
that. I like that approach, which is probably a good way to live, honestly.
I
I
think
think.
it's good to some degree, but I think you could become so uncertain that you can't that you're no practical value, right?
Hmm.
So from a Christian perspective, there are levels of certainty that we claim, but we don't claim those levels of certainty based on our own ability. So that's the difference, right? So when you're a naturalist, you can only claim certainty to the degree that you are basically a brain in a vat with perception, right? So, but for a Christian, we don't claim certainty based on our understanding, on our knowledge, and our capabilities, because we're not alone. If you are a Christian, you are inhabited by the Holy Spirit, who is the one that can give you certainty and from a theological perspective, assurance, right? So you can from that faith perspective, right? Faith is not unreasonable, right? Faith can be reasonable because you have not only your ability to reason, but you also have a counselor that lives within you, right? So so
And
for,
that's the
for us,
point that I was
that's
trying to
where we
make
get
about
some of that
wisdom.
certainty from.
Yeah, that's the point that I was trying to make about wisdom. And it is informed intelligence, but it's informed by, again, it has to be constrained. Because if you're informed by the wrong thing, right? Then you end up with eugenics, you become a Nazi, like there's just all sorts of horrible things that can happen to you, right? Or you become a hedonist or whatever. It's wisdom actually by the nature of people know when you're wise. They'll come up and say, they don't even have to be Christians to know when you're being wise. They'll just say that's a wise decision. Probably wise to wait, right? Probably wise not to lean too far over the side of a mountain. Why, like they'll say that. It could be could be Christ within you saying, it's not time for you to die yet, right? But the point is, it's there's other people know when they see something as being wise or not wise, right? That's the point I'm making.
Well,
Absolutely.
Wisdom is
sometimes,
always informed by something that leads to something good. Always.
yeah.
In
Well, I
every
think sometimes, right? But I think, intelligence is knowing how to, or knowledge is knowing how to, or finding out how to affix technology like a computer chip into someone's brain, like Neuralink. Wisdom is wondering whether or not that should be done, right?
Right.
And I feel like,
Wisdom has an understanding of potential consequences, right?
well,
right.
just ask Elon and his new BFF if they think it's
Well,
right.
it's
Let
like
that work out.
it's like that scene from Jurassic Park when they're talking to the doctor, the Malcolm guy. He's like, or basically, what's his face? He's the same guy, Jeff Goldblum, in every movie. And they're talking to him, and they say, Jeff Goldblum's character responds by saying, you were so concerned or obsessed with, finding out whether you could do something that you didn't think about whether you should
Think
do
about
something.
whether it was the right thing to do.
In
That's
this
right. Oh
case,
yeah.
yeah,
I remember that. That's
it's,
right. That's wisdom, right? That's the
yeah,
difference between having the knowledge and the ability to do something
right,
versus the discretion and discernment to say, well, is that good,
a good
right? And
idea.
so
Yeah.
that leads me to my point, and I asked Justin to pull this up on the screen because this is a life verse for me, right? Where in 1 Thessalonians 5:21 it says, "Test everything, hold fast to that which is good," right? And abstain from every form of evil. So that's the problem we have today, which is the definition of what is good, right? And you were talking about it earlier, Chandler, which I thought was very, very, very sharp, which is you have this huge push to make everything subjective, right?
Hmm.
That particularly morality, right? Morality is
Hmm.
subjective. There's no true objective morality, but because to say that there's an objective morality is to infer that there is a source of
Mhm.
objective morality, right? And the naturalists cannot abide, well, particularly the atheistic naturalists cannot
Mhm.
abide by that, because because that's a direct, if you've got a source,
Mhm.
what's the source? Well, it's got to be personal. Well, if
You
it's a
can't
personal
agree. You
source
can't agree.
and it's
You can't.
transcendent, what does that
Yeah.
point you to, right?
Yeah.
Well,
So,
naturalism's wrong, right? At that
right,
point.
exactly. So when
Well, I thought,
when people talk about good, I'm always like, well, what's your standard of good?
Yeah.
Right? What's your
Yeah.
standard?
so
Everybody,
anyway,
even the subjective
go
people
ahead.
with subjective morality, they tend to become very objective about morality when they're the ones being threatened, right?
You're darn tootin'. You're darn tootin'.
I think that's
When morality was when you have the consequences of morality of someone else maybe not having objective morality being
Agreed.
applied to you, you get objective very quickly.
yeah. You know, it's
It's
like,
really
you know,
good.
you may say
Yeah, that's
it's
not nice. That's a nice.
Yeah. you may say it's okay, you know, people in other parts of the world may have this particular view. Let's say, you know, some group of people somewhere in the world has a perspective that it's okay to, like, you know, remove people's ears. That's all fine and good until you're the one that they're, you know,
Remove
Yeah.
people's
deciding
ears.
to remove the ears from, right?
Yeah.
And so
Hey, I use cannibalism. That's a good one too, right?
that's a good one too. Yeah. Until
Yeah.
you're on, you know,
All right.
It reminds me-
Until you're on the menu, right?
yeah. So I don't know. This is kind of a funny aside about that, but there, you know, the Packer, the guy who ate his friends in the Wild West, or ate people in the Wild West. I think the University of Colorado, some university there, they sort of satirically named their dining hall after him, or after
Oh, my
someone who
Lord.
has that name, Packer.
Oh
And
Lord.
in the dining hall, they have this saying, or this, like, written on the wall: "Have your friends for dinner,"
Oh my
which
Lord.
is which is pretty funny when you think
Oh
about
my
it.
Lord.
But sorry,
Well,
that was just
but
something.
it goes back to why not, right?
Yeah.
Why not? Why not? Why
Yeah.
not
They're
be
just,
Hannibal
they're just
Lecter?
another biological source of protein.
Yeah.
Right. Hey, if you look
Ultimate
again,
veganism.
if you start decomposing it and becoming very, very reductionist, right?
Yeah.
If you have that framework where you're just reducing everything to its basic elements, you can almost just, I think you can justify anything, right?
Oh yeah.
Well,
Well, people have.
the one reason why I brought him into this, without talking about eating more people, um,
No,
is
where did that rabbit go? All right.
yeah,
Long
right,
fork.
right. It's the seeking of wisdom, and I like his title, "We Who Wrestle with God." I mean, you can say lots of things about him, but I like the title because as Christians, I think that's what we're supposed to do, which is a weird thing to say. You know, I think and I'm go back to the story of Jacob. You know, Jacob is about to meet his brother Esau, and he goes out. He's out, and he sees this man, and he wrestles with him, which is kind of a weird story. Like,
Yeah.
he must have thought he was an intruder or something. And that's where this wrestling with God comes from. Like like you're seeking, you're asking the question why, like Job, and you become changed by the answer. And one of the ways you become changed is that truth cuts a groove through you. That's what happens. It cuts a groove through you, and now you're different, and your whole way of thinking, everything else, it just doesn't work the same way, right? And it
Mhm.
works in a better way. That's the point of wisdom, and that's why I like this title. I also like, more than that, I like that this is starting to become to roll back into pop culture these days. I noticed that with the advent of Trump, and I use that term somewhat facetiously, um, there's also a movement towards God where this is. I saw this on a mainstream you know newscast, and so people are starting to look back, like the last 4 years, especially in this country, have been so morally devoid of any kind of calculus that people are really starting to ask this question. Oh, we've gone really far down the road. Now,
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
what's going on? And I'm starting to see this more in pop culture, and people are starting to look for wisdom, which I thought was really good. And it reminds me of what the book of Proverbs actually says in the beginning, is wisdom cries out in the streets, right? I'm paraphrasing, but it talks about how if you really look, it's obvious that this vanity of all vanities is around, and wisdom is saying you got to find the answer to this, and that's the point.
I
That
think
being said, are we ready for the conquering
Well,
hero?
I think Chandler had something.
Oh, so
well, I
go
was
ahead.
gonna say with whole movement towards God. I mean, I'd say it's been longer than the last 4 years that we've been wandering in this wasteland, right?
Oh, sure.
Closer to 40 than 4, it seems. And I think also Trump, it's, I think he might be more of a symptom than it necessarily than like the cause, right? Maybe he's emboldened people to be more public about, whatever perspective they have. But, Trump himself, I don't know if he was the one who directly like caused it, right? I would say it's been interesting also to see in my age group, like my generation, especially among like men my age,
Yep.
to see the hunger for tradition.
And for
And that's what it
something
is.
stable, and for something that's stable and something that means something. Yeah, I think you're right. I don't think that Trump is causing this at all. I think that
Trump.
Trump
No,
is
I
just
think he's the avatar of it.
Yeah,
he
he's
is.
riding the wave.
He's just the vehicle that God has chosen to make a point, to be
Yep.
honest.
Yeah.
And but it is interesting what's happening in this deal, because here's this guy. There's the parallels that are coming, right? So this is at Madison Square Garden, what you're seeing over here, and this is his advent. I keep using that term. His basically his walking into that area.
This is Trump's triumphal entry.
It's just like, and that's what happened is
triumph.
they were talking about a lot of things happened with this. Like you see down here, this guy right here is a bad man. This is the UFC fighter, and he as soon as he knocks the other guy out, he does the Trump dance.
He does, yeah.
And then when you start seeing that, that means it's like this force. It's like it's like a warm front or cold front overtaking a warm front. Something has changed, right? There's a status change that's happening, and these guys are now popular. Where the last 4 years they were pariahs, like they were just, So it's just interesting.
Like a gladiator.
Yeah, that's exactly
presenting.
right. You're right. It's modern. It's the modern Coliseum, right?
Yeah.
Very much.
The modern Coliseum.
I mean, when you look at it, like Trump, he has his summer palace here in Florida where he entertains foreign dignitaries, right? He's just like
the winter
Roman
White House.
emperor of all. Goes to fights with his buddies. He makes his weird hippie friend eat McDonald's, like it's
I love that.
No, I got that one. I got that one. I got that one right here. Look at that.
I love
finish
that.
the burger. Finish the burger,
like,
Robert.
He's like, I'll hold it, but I ain't eating it.
No, it's the joke that you said. It's like a mob leader. Chandler told me there was a meme running around. I couldn't find it, but the meme was like if you're trying to find out whether somebody's a spy or not, if they eat the McDonald's.
It's like
It's
drugs
a shibboleth.
or kill the guy.
It's a shibboleth. There you
Exactly.
go.
Yeah, it's like the mob or something. I don't know.
I just think it's funny. You have Mike Johnson in this picture too. He's kind of hanging out
Oh,
behind the.
Mike Johnson is funny too, because there he is, right? He's he's very much like a Where's Waldo these days.
He's like your elder.
And when you look at the group walking in to Trump's triumphal entry, he's like a full head shorter than everybody. It's like,
and when you look at him,
not that height matters. It's just funny because he's just kind of beep 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 beep.
It's a funny optic is what it is. Yeah. Go ahead, Sam.
Funny too because he's like Ned Flanders, right? He's the super conservative religious guy who, installed Covenant Eyes on all of his kids' devices and talks all about, these things. And he's hanging out with, these guys going to UFC fights,
Ladies and gentlemen, the compromise of politics right there.
There you go, right? It's just interesting because
I actually think Mike Johnson's probably a pretty good guy.
I think he's probably very genuine, kind of like Pence, right? But I think it's interesting how much history is rhyming for us. And I don't know how much of this is just almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, but when you look at Caesar, his rise to power, and later on Augustus, right? There's some interesting similarities between Trump and Caesar, right? exiled essentially to
See,
Florida
see,
or
I'm
Gaul.
almost thinking, I'm almost, and look, and I am not a Trump worshiper in any sense
Yeah.
of the word, but if any, I think it would maybe be a more appropriate analogy or comparison to compare him to Constantine.
It's interesting.
Ooh,
It's interesting.
Because if you think about it, you've
That's
got this immoral chaos of
Mm.
Roman civilization, and you've got the emergence of Christianity,
Mm.
and you see the population start to be drawn to some sort of moral ascendance, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot. They talk about how often do you think of ancient Rome, but I actually think about cycles of history more than anything
Yeah.
else, right? Because I really think about the cycle of immorality to morality, immorality to
Mhm.
morality. And if you look at the cycle of history, man, it really goes back and forth between those two. And what
Yeah.
happens is, and this is kind of my observation, is you've got the immorality that's ascendant, and then you start getting people that move this way and they go more toward the morality piece. But then because it's human nature, because then they want to take their morality and apply it to everybody, right?
Yeah. Whether they like it
And
or not.
then they start to legislate morality,
Mhm.
and then you have people start to react against that, right? And so it swings too far every
Mm.
time. It swings too far, and you're
we're
going to see
very
this.
much going to
You're
see
going to
that.
see it.
And
You're going to see this happening. You're going to see that we are swinging toward a more quote unquote biblical morality, right? But that biblical morality, just like what happened with the Puritans, right, had the greatest intent in the world, but they went into legalism. They went to some
Mhm.
legislate morality. Then you had that reaction.
Mhm.
and you had
So
witch
Mhm.
trials, and you had ridiculousness.
exactly.
You
So
know, it's
that
interesting too.
to me is the moral cycle of history, right? The
What was
moral
the
cycle of
test?
history.
Yeah, and I think what's even more interesting is as we get deeper into Ecclesiastes, we talk about vanities. He explains that in that pattern, that cyclical pattern you're talking about, where we go towards good chaos and then bad chaos, good order, bad order. And that whole cycle, the preacher is going to talk about in Ecclesiastes, and that's why I say that the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus's actual words on how to actually live with God in the kingdom of God are the only cure. It's the only cure for that existential hangover. Is the point that I think is being made. But it's very interesting too that what? How many years ago did Solomon write his thing? He wrote in about 1000 BC. We're in 2025, so about 2025. So
About 3,000
3,000 years.
years
Long
ago.
time ago.
Yeah, 3,000 years ago. Here's basically the preacher says there's this condition with man, with all of us, and it's still here today. We haven't engineered ourselves out of it. We haven't. The AIs aren't fixing it, right? It's still here. Is the point, right?
Yeah,
Excellent.
because ultimately, and I believe the Bible teaches this very clearly, that it is ultimately about individual morality, right? That even I think God teaches this too as a meta narrative in Scripture, is that we tend to want to found our morality on institutions and objects. And when God is saying, no, 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 you're an image of me. What you
Okay.
need to do is focus on how your individual image portrays me. And that's why
Mhm.
Christ, being the very nature of God, the character of God, individually revealed to us in Scripture, Jesus didn't go out going, "Thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt." He was like, "Look, it's much simpler than that. It's much simpler than that." And so he's not saying, "Go look at this government, go look at this person." Although we do look to him, obviously, as our guide, as our character, guide to our lives. But at the same time, he's like, love me, love your neighbor, and the way you do that is by loving yourself as an image of me.
That's right.
And I
And that's
think
the only way it makes sense, by the way.
Yeah,
yeah,
and it's not,
last thing.
and loving yourself as an image of him is not a selfish love, right?
No,
It's not a self-focused love, right? It's an outward focused love from an inward, an inward understanding, wisdom, for God's sake.
yeah. Yeah. So last thing I can say before I have to get to work, it's interesting to me, the Bible, you can read individual chapters, individual books, verses, and they have importance in a story, but there's almost there's definitely a meta aspect or a meta narrative, right, to the Bible. And part of it, I think, is you see these couplings, right? You see the questions asked by Solomon being answered by Jesus, right? You see the idea of the first Adam and the second Adam, right? You see this kind of query and a response, or an action and a response. And it's interesting because in that way, the Bible becomes much more than, because I've heard it said the Bible is more like a library than a book, right?
Yep.
It
Yep.
has
Like an
66 or
anthology.
however many. And yeah, okay, that's part of it, right? Each book is separate for a reason, right? But at the same time, the canon is a canon too, right? And there's definitely a larger meaning to be drawn from it. And this is something that Christians throughout, the ages have recognized, right? And thought about. This isn't something that modern theologians and scholars have derived, right? There's definitely, but even at Solomon's time, right? And he talks about it a little bit later in the book of Ecclesiastes. He didn't have access to the Gospels, right? He
Right.
wouldn't have known, the exact nature of the Messiah, right? But, like other patriarchs, like Abraham, like all of these other guys, he knew that someone was coming, right? He had a hope. And even if he didn't have the exact answer, he knew where that answer would come from, right? And he
Yeah.
talks about that at the end of Ecclesiastes, right?
That's
He
right.
sort of answers himself in a way,
That's right.
right? About what to do.
So
And
the
I think
best
that's a
class, Chandler,
Yeah.
the best class that I had in seminary, well, this was at RTS Jackson, was from a guy named Miles Van Pelt, and it was free.
Yeah,
And you were there. You were young, but you were
I
there.
remember. Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
vaguely.
And it was just something where Miles was,
Big,
he's
big name.
a Hebrew scholar.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how and why the canon is stitched together. And
Yeah.
if you go through, you make a great point about Solomon's time, because they had, at the time of Solomon, they had the Adamic covenant, they had the Noahic covenant, they had the Abrahamic covenant, and then they had the Davidic covenant. That's what he was aware of. And all of these things, based on how the law was applied to the children of Israel, and the fact that grace was actually written into the law, even in the Deuteronomic code, there was grace put in there. Solomon would know. He would absolutely know that there has to be this salvific event
Right.
that would have to come later on, and they were all looking towards that, right? And
Yeah.
really, what I think the book of Ecclesiastes does is it actually goes in and looks and says, okay, you see, this is what you guys are doing, and it's getting us nowhere.
Yeah.
Then it's the covenant and the Torah and the law that says the law is here to honor God, and there's this God that wants to redeem us, and this is how. That's what this is pointing to, this purity. We see that this is impure. Now there's a pure side, is what we don't have wisdom here. There is a place where we can get wisdom. That's, I think, the point. And you brought up a good point about that.
Yeah. Well, how eternally meaningful. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
How eternally meaningful is something that even the most vague understanding and acknowledgement of it can bring meaning. Like,
That's right.
I think about that in reference to this, right? I mean, he did know that the salvific event would come, right? But he didn't know when, right? He didn't know exactly who or what that would look like, right?
Yep.
He was a human being and he was limited despite his wisdom, right? And there's no evidence that God, told him in detail about his plans and what exactly would occur, right? But even the faintest acknowledgement and understanding of this promise, right? This hope for a salvific event, even that seems to have the ability to give people meaning and hope. So how much larger, right, is the actual event? And I think, or understanding the actual event. And I think that's sort of beautiful. So that was the last thing I could say. I definitely have to get to work before
Yeah,
All
and
right. Yeah.
my boss
I think
says
that's a
like, "What are you
great,
doing?"
I think that's a great transition point for us.
Sure.
And I really, from kind of my final thought is, this statement by Solomon here is indicative of and I told you I was going to beat up material naturalism, but is indicative of the hopelessness of a material naturalistic worldview. Because if we're just time, space, matter, and energy, then nothing means anything, and all is indeed vanity.
Yeah, definitely. All right. It was good talking to you guys.
Good talking to you too.
Bye.
All right. Do
Later.
you want to talk? We can go a little bit longer, JD. Or
Oh
do
no,
you...
I think we've done a good session. I don't want to polish the BB or become so enamored of our own wit that we
Oh,
you
I
know
think I'm pretty funny.
Shakespeare said, what did he say? Brevity is the soul of wit. So, from my perspective, I think this was a great conversation. Enjoyed having Chandler. It's great having us gray beards, right, or gray heads, whatever you want to call it. Benefit from having that perspective. And I'll tell you, I mean, and I'm seeing this in my son as well. Is to some degree, we are seeing some young people learning from, taking those lessons learned vicariously by seeing the mistakes we've made. So I have hope that for this next generation that they can, take advantage of all of the mistakes that have been made in the past, and be mindful of the the circularity, the pendulum swing of history, and maybe slow down the cycle a little bit.
I think, and the thing I'm going to add to that is, watching. It's one of the true hopes I have as a Christian, and as a father, right? Is I alluded to it earlier, and that's the talk about the covenant. And when you can see your children, there's some promises in the Bible about your children, especially when you have them in church and you're doing what you can, even in your flawed way, to teach them about who God is. That He covers in those spaces where you can't know.
Right.
Like, and I look back at my own life, and I just know there are places where, I I don't deserve that grace, and to watch my children thrive is one of the great that it actually gives me personally, gives me hope, and
Yeah.
it is the wisdom of the future. I did want to add, for next time, we've got a couple of blogs to talk about. We also got a book coming out. We've got, I think we can grow this in a good way. I really appreciate you guys for listening. We're going to try and make this as regular as we can all do. And I hope you got something out of this. Till next time.